The animal in this footage looks like it is sleeping. It is curled against a gloved hand, dark-furred, impossibly small, smaller than the hand that holds it. Its eyes are sealed shut. Its chest is not moving. The woman holding it is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the animal, and her expression is the expression of someone who is counting. This was recorded at 2:59 p.m. on May 14th on a flat stretch of frozen tundra in the Svalbard archipelago, 78 degrees north of the equator. What the camera cannot show you is the hole in the ice 2 meters behind them. It cannot show you the drill equipment or the other 2 animals already wrapped inside someone's jacket nearby. It cannot show you what is still 2 meters below the ground. They are standing on the collapsed chamber where this animal spent the first 10 days of its life. What you can see is the hand and the animal and the woman counting. The Arctic fox kit, dark gray, barely breathing, newly pulled from 2 meters of frozen earth, had no way of knowing what the next 44 seconds would decide. Neither did anyone else. What brought them all to that moment had started 3 days earlier with a ranger named Elena Marsh cutting the engine of her snowmobile on a routine morning patrol and seeing something on the ice. The morning of May 14th had started like every other patrol morning, cold. Still the kind of flat Svalbard light that makes distances hard to judge. Elena Marsh was 31 years old and had worked for the Norwegian Environment Agency since she was 25. Before Svalbard, she had done 2 seasons in Finnmark, monitoring wolverine populations, and 1 winter on Jan Mayen, counting seabirds in weather that made Spitsbergen feel temperate. She was not someone who startled easily, and she was not someone who misread animal behavior. What she was looking at did not make sense. The fox was a female small. Even by Arctic fox standards, Elena guessed 2.5, maybe 3 kilograms, the lean weight of an animal in late pregnancy or early nursing. Her winter coat was still mostly white, which meant she was likely a resident of the inland tundra, rather than the coastal population where the blue morph was more common. She was digging at the base of a low rise, a place where the hillside met a flat shelf of ground that had accumulated deep snow over the winter. The kind of sheltered south-facing hollow that Elena had seen foxes use for denning before. The fox's front paws were moving without stopping. Her muzzle was low, almost touching the surface, and every few seconds she would pause and hold completely still, not resting but listening before resuming with the same frantic energy. Elena documented the location coordinates and took 30 seconds of footage on her field camera before reaching for her radio. She needed James. Dr. James Calloway had been the senior wildlife veterinarian for the Svalbard Environmental Protection Fund for 19 years. He was 53 years old, methodical in the way that people who have spent decades making decisions in remote locations tend to be. And he had a particular expertise in Arctic fox reproductive biology that Elena had relied on more than once in the past. He arrived at kilometer post 7:50 minutes after her call, pulling up in the agency's tracked vehicle with a surveying pack and a ground acoustic sensor that the team had used the previous season to locate a den collapse on the eastern coast of Nordenskjöld Land. He watched the fox for 2 full minutes without speaking. "That's not foraging behavior," he said finally. Elena told him she knew. Calloway set up the acoustic sensor 30 meters from where the fox was working, driving the spike carefully into the frozen ground to avoid vibration interference. The device worked by detecting low-frequency sound waves traveling through frozen substrate, the same principle used in structural engineering to locate voids and fractures in ice and permafrost. He had used it to find collapsed dens before, but always after the fact, always working backwards from an absence. He had never used it like this, following an animal that was already telling him where to look. The readout took 4 minutes to stabilize. When it did, Calloway stared at it for a long moment before handing the display to Elena without comment. 2 meters below the surface, directly beneath the point where the fox was digging, the sensor had detected an air pocket approximately 1 meter wide and 60 centimeters high. And within that air pocket there was movement. Elena looked at the fox and then back at the display. Calloway was already pulling up the regional monitoring database on his field tablet, cross-referencing the GPS coordinates against the Norwegian Polar Institute's denning records for this area. It took him less than 3 minutes. The location matched a den site that had been documented and tagged the previous autumn, a multi-chamber underground system that a female Arctic fox field ID, AVF2291, had been observed preparing in October. A VF2291 had been fitted with a passive transponder tag during a population survey in 2022. 3 years old. First recorded breeding season. The den preparation had been logged as a positive indicator for the local population recovery program. Callaway pulled up the meteorological records for the past week. On the night of May 11th, a late-season polar storm had crossed Spitsbergen from the northwest. The kind of event that was becoming more common as the climate shifted, a deep winter system arriving weeks past the point when the tundra had begun to soften. Temperatures had dropped 18 degrees in 6 hours. The wind had driven wet, heavy snow into every exposed surface on the island. The kind of event that could compromise a den that had been structurally weakened by early spring thaw. Elena had read the storm reports when they came through on May 12th. She had filed a note to check the known den sites in the southern Adventdalen corridor as soon as weather permitted. She had not yet gotten to Kilometer Post 7. The monitoring program covered 41 documented sites across 2 study areas, and a single ranger running welfare checks after a major weather event was working against simple arithmetic. She had started at the northern sites and was working south. She was 2 days late. Callaway did not say that, and Elena did not say it, and they both understood that saying it would accomplish nothing at all. The tundra had its own indifference to human scheduling. What mattered now was the readout and the fox and the numbers. The acoustic sensor had also returned a secondary data point that Callaway circled on the display with a stylus and showed to Elena without speaking. The air temperature inside the detected pocket was 4.3 degrees Celsius. Outside it was -26. The pocket had been holding warmth. Residual warmth from the animals inside it, conducted and retained by the surrounding frozen earth in the way that a well-built den is designed to function. It was the den doing its job even in collapse. It was also, Callaway said, why the kits were still alive. Arctic fox dens are not simple burrows. They are complex structures, often with multiple chambers and redundant tunnels, built over years and sometimes generations by successive families that improve and expand what they inherit. The den at Kilometer Post 7 had been in the monitoring database since 2017. It had been used in at least 3 previous breeding seasons before AVF2291 selected it. When the storm drove the collapse, the main entrance chamber had failed. But the rear denning chamber, deeper and better insulated, had held. The kits were not buried under rubble. They were in a sealed room with 4 degrees of warmth and a finite amount of air. And their mother had been on the surface for 72 hours, doing the only thing she knew how to do. Elena looked at the fox, who had paused her digging again and was standing perfectly still with her nose pressed to the ice. She looked like she was reading something. Elena did the arithmetic. A VF2291's pups, if born on schedule, would have arrived in the first week of May. They would be at most 10 days old. At 10 days, Arctic fox kits cannot regulate their own body temperature. They cannot hear. They have not yet opened their eyes. They are, in every practical sense, entirely dependent on the den structure that their mother built to keep them alive. Callaway said it quietly, looking at the sensor readout, and then at the fox, and then back at the numbers. She's been listening to them through 2 meters of collapsed ice and frozen earth for 72 hours. Elena found she had nothing to say to that. The fox paused in her digging and held still again, that same focused, absolute stillness, and in the silence, Elena could almost feel the particular quality of attention in it. Not fear, not confusion, something older and more specific than either. There is a concept in wildlife biology sometimes described as the motivational persistence threshold. The point at which an animal's drive to perform a behavior overrides competing survival pressures, like hunger, thermoregulation, and predator avoidance. Researchers who study it tend to describe it in careful, qualified language, noting the difficulty of attributing internal states to non-human animals without sufficient behavioral evidence. Standing at Kilometer Post 7 on a still May morning, watching a 3-kilogram fox dig with bleeding paws at a collapsed den. For the 3rd consecutive day, Elena thought the behavioral evidence was fairly clear. What happened next would require more than 2 people and a ground sensor. Calloway was already on the radio to Longyearbyen. Marcus Tran arrived from Longyearbyen at just past noon. He was a geotechnical engineer with the Norwegian Polar Institute, 38 years old, and he had spent the better part of the previous decade drilling core samples and structural assessments in some of the most technically unforgiving terrain on the planet. He was not a wildlife person, but what Calloway needed was not a wildlife person. What he needed was someone who understood exactly what happened to a void space in frozen substrate when you applied pressure vibration or thermal change in the wrong sequence. Marcus looked at the acoustic readout, looked at the topography of the collapse zone, and spent 11 minutes making calculations on a pad of graph paper before he said anything at all. The problem was geometric. The air pocket was 2 meters below the surface, but the collapse had not been uniform. The storm had driven the failure from the northwest, which meant the pocket was offset from the original den entrance by approximately 40 centimeters. Drilling straight down from above was not an option. The weight of a drill rig on the compromised surface could initiate a secondary collapse before they reached the chamber. The solution was a lateral approach from the hillside, a controlled diagonal bore that would intersect the chamber at its highest point, preserving the structural integrity of the pocket while allowing air exchange and eventual extraction. The margin for error was 15 centimeters in any direction. They had one drill, one attempt, and somewhere between 4 and 6 hours of viable oxygen remaining in the chamber based on Calloway's estimate of the pup's age and metabolic rate. Calloway had also done a second calculation that he shared with Elena quietly away from the equipment staging area. The chamber temperature, based on the acoustic sensor's thermal readings, was already below the lower survivability threshold for neonatal Arctic fox kits. If any of the pups were going to make it, the next few hours were the only window. Elena looked at AVF 2291, who had moved away from the digging site when the equipment arrived but had not gone far. She was sitting on a low ice shelf 20 meters away, watching. Her paws, Elena could see now, through binoculars, were dark with dried blood against the white of her coat. She had not eaten in 3 days. She was sitting in minus 26 degrees of open wind without shelter, and she was watching. Marcus finished his setup at 12:47 and began the bore at 12:52. The drill was a compact rotary percussion unit designed for permafrost core sampling, loud, vibrating, mechanically absolute in the way that heavy tools are when there is no margin for gentleness. The fox flinched at the sound, but did not retreat. She moved to a position slightly closer, in fact, stepping down from the ice shelf to the flat ground, her body oriented toward the drill site, with the particular focused stillness that Elena had been watching all morning. The bore progressed at roughly 4 centimeters per minute through the upper frozen layer, slowing to 2 centimeters per minute as Marcus hit the harder ice substrate at 60 centimeters depth. At 90 centimeters, the drill encountered a band of embedded rock that had not appeared on the acoustic readout. Marcus stopped immediately. He spent 8 minutes recalculating, adjusting the bore angle by 3 degrees to route around the obstruction before resuming. Elena did not look at her watch during those 8 minutes. She looked at the fox, who had not moved. At 1:44 p.m., with the bore at 180 centimeters, the drill resistance changed. Marcus felt it before the readout showed it a slight drop in torque as the bit entered the air pocket. He withdrew the drill in a single careful motion, and they all watched the borehole. A column of warmer air rose from the opening, barely visible, like breath in cold weather. The fox was on her feet. She covered the 20 meters to the drill site in seconds and pushed her muzzle into the borehole before anyone could react. She held it there completely still for nearly 10 seconds. Then she made a sound. It was high and sharp, and nothing like the barks or screams that Arctic foxes produce under stress. Calloway, who had spent 19 years documenting Arctic fox vocalizations across Svalbard, said afterward that he had heard that particular call only twice before in the field, and both times it had been a mother fox making contact with kits that had wandered from the den. It was not a distress call. It was a contact call. It meant, "I am here. I have found you." From somewhere 2 meters below the frozen ground, something answered. Calloway looked at Elena and did not say anything. Elena looked at Marcus and did not say anything either. Marcus picked up the hand excavation tools. Widening the bore channel to extraction diameter took another 40 minutes of careful work, removing material in small controlled increments to avoid disturbing the surrounding structure. The fox moved with them as they worked, circling the site, pausing every few minutes to push her muzzle into the opening. At 2:31 p.m., the channel was wide enough. Calloway reached in with a long-handled extraction sleeve, a soft mesh tube used for handling small mammals without direct contact, and made careful contact with the first pup. It was smaller than his fist. Its eyes were sealed shut. Its fur was dark gray, almost charcoal, the birth coloring of Arctic fox kits before the white winter coat develops. It was breathing. Calloway passed it immediately to Elena, who placed it against her chest inside her field jacket and held it there. The second pup came out 3 minutes later, also breathing, also dark, curled tight in the defensive posture of a very young animal that cannot yet run. Calloway passed it to Marcus, who held it against his own chest without being asked, wrapping his jacket closed with one hand. The third pup was at the far edge of the chamber. The extraction sleeve could not reach it. Calloway asked for the flexible camera probe, threaded it through the channel, and confirmed on the display that the pup was present and positioned against the back wall of the collapsed space. It was not moving. He asked Marcus if there was any way to extend the channel laterally without destabilizing the structure. Marcus said it would take 20 minutes minimum. Calloway said, "Then we take 20 minutes." The lateral extension work was done in silence. Elena stood with her back to the wind, holding the first pup against her body, watching the color readout on Calloway's thermal probe as Marcus worked. The chamber temperature had dropped another 2 degrees since they had opened the bore. At 2:58 p.m., the extension was complete. Calloway reached in and found the third pup. By feel, worked the extraction sleeve around it with 2 fingers and drew it out slowly. It lay in his palm without moving. Its chest was still. Its eyes were sealed, and its small dark face was slack in a way that was different from the sleep of the other 2. Calloway placed it on a flat surface and began chest compressions with 2 fingers, 1 per second, the way the protocol specified for neonatal canids. Elena counted in her head. She got to 31 before she stopped counting and just watched. At 44 seconds, the pup moved. Not dramatically, not in the way that might make a good photograph. Its chest rose once, catching, and then again, and then the tiny dark body drew a breath that was audible in the quiet of the tundra afternoon. Calloway exhaled slowly and did not move for a moment. He then placed the pup against his chest, exactly as Elena had done, with the first closing his jacket over it, with a steadiness that Elena recognized as the particular composure of someone who has learned to hold their reactions until the work is finished. A VF-2291 was standing at the edge of the work area. She had not moved during the extraction. Now she stepped forward and bent her head toward Calloway's jacket, pushing her muzzle gently against the fabric. She held it there, breathing. Then she moved to Marcus, and then to Elena, pressing her nose briefly against each of the places where her kits were held. She made no sound. She simply checked and found them, and stood among the 3 humans who had them and waited. Calloway looked up at Elena from where he was kneeling in the snow. "In 19 years, he said quietly, "I have never had a wild fox do that." Elena looked at AV. F-22913 kilograms of exhausted, bleeding, undefeated animal standing in the wind, with her eyes half closed, and found she had no useful response to offer. Sometimes the facts are enough on their own. The pups were alive. 3 of them, 2 meters under the ice, in the hands of people who had driven through the afternoon to reach them. But alive at kilometer post 7 in minus 26 degrees and alive in a care facility in Longyearbyen were 2 very different things. They had maybe 90 minutes to make that distance matter. The Svalbard Wildlife Care Facility in Longyearbyen was not large. It had been built primarily to handle injured seabirds and the occasional reindeer, and its capacity for small mammal-intensive care was limited to 2 heated enclosures with temperature regulation precise enough for neonates. Dr. Lena Solberg, the facility's director, had both enclosures prepared and waiting when Elena and Calloway arrived at 4:15 p.m. She worked without speaking for the first hour, assessing each pup with the focused efficiency of someone who understands that commentary can wait. The first 2 pups, the ones who had been breathing when extracted, were hypothermic but stable. Their core temperatures had dropped to 32 degrees Celsius against a normal neonate range of 36 to 37, and their reflexes were slow, but slow is not absent. Lena wrapped them together in a single heated pouch. Neonatal foxes are social thermoregulators, she explained without looking up. They need contact warmth as much as ambient warmth, and placed the unit in the lower enclosure at 35 degrees. The third pup required more. Its core temperature on arrival was 29.4 degrees, and Lena spent 40 minutes on supportive intervention before she was satisfied that it was stabilizing rather than continuing to decline. She said at the end of those 40 minutes that she thought all three would recover. She said it in the careful way that experienced clinicians use when they mean it, but understand that medicine does not make guarantees. A VF-2291 had been transported in a separate carrier and placed in the adjacent enclosure. She had not eaten in 3 days, and her paws required cleaning and treatment for the abrasions from the digging. But she was in no acute danger. Foxes in the wild. Routinely fast during early denning, it is a normal feature of the reproductive biology. What was not normal was the duration and the expenditure and the outcome. Lena looked at the fox through the enclosure glass for a long moment before turning back to her notes. 3 weeks later, Elena drove back to Longyearbyen on a different kind of errand. The pups were still at the facility. They were also now unmistakably fox-shaped. The dark birth fur giving way to the first faint suggestion of gray-white at the edges. Small pointed faces that tracked movement, with eyes that had been open for less than a week. They nursed from AVF-229 4 times a day, and spent the intervals in a pile against her flank, sleeping with a total commitment of animals that have no other obligations. Dr. Priya Nair had arrived from the University of Tromsø 10 days earlier. She was a behavioral ecologist who had spent 15 years studying cognition and social learning in Arctic canids. And when Callaway had sent her the acoustic data and the extraction footage, she had rearranged her schedule and driven to the airport. She was interested in the digging behavior, which was not by itself unusual. What interested her was its duration and its directionality. A fox that digs at a collapsed den for 20 minutes an hour, even a few hours, that is not surprising. That is persistence. And persistence in maternal behavior has been documented across many species. 72 hours is a different thing. 72 hours in -26 degrees without food, without shelter, with no behavioral signal from the outside environment, suggesting that the effort was working. That is something that the existing literature does not adequately address. Priya was careful about the language she used. She was a scientist, and science is specific about the difference between what the data shows and what we want the data to mean. She said in the field notes she shared with Elena that the behavior was consistent with what researchers sometimes called motivated persistence, a state in which goal-directed behavior is maintained in the absence of positive reinforcement by some mechanism that current models of animal cognition do not fully account for. She said the acoustic data suggested that the fox was likely receiving low-frequency vibration signals through the permafrost, faint, intermittent, probably irregular, and that this may have provided sufficient information to sustain the behavior across the 3-day period. She said may have. She said probably. And then at the end of her field notes in a section she labeled discussion and separated from the rest with a single line break she wrote one sentence that she did not qualify. The data explains the mechanism. It does not explain the choice. Elena read that sentence 3 times and did not disagree with it. On July 18th, 8 weeks after the extraction, AVF-2291 and her 3 kits were released at kilometer post 7. The release was not ceremonial. There were no cameras and no officials because Priya had argued and Lena had agreed that a low-disturbance release in familiar territory gave the family the best chance for a normal denning season before winter. The transport carrier was placed on the tundra 50 meters from the collapse site, which had been marked with a monitoring pin. The door was opened. AVF-2291 came out first, moving low and careful, her nose reading the air. She stopped oriented and moved toward the hillside with purpose, not running, not hesitating, simply going the way an animal goes when it knows where it is. The kits followed in a loose cluster, stumbling over the tundra vegetation with the extravagant incompetence of 8-week-old animals encountering real ground for the first time. The smallest one, the one Calloway had spent 44 seconds over, stopped once at the edge of the willow scrub and sat down in the manner of an animal that has found something interesting underfoot. Its mother circled back, nudged it forward, and disappeared into the low growth. Elena stood with her hands in her pockets and watched until there was nothing left to watch. Calloway stood beside her and did the same. There was nothing particular to say. The following October, the Norwegian Environment Agency formally launched the Svalbard Den Monitoring Initiative, a network of 43 passive thermal sensors distributed across the primary Arctic fox denning areas of Spitsbergen, connected to an automated alert system at the Longyearbyen station. The system was designed to detect anomalous temperature drops in active den sites during the early nursing period, when kits are most vulnerable to structural failure events. It was the first monitoring program of its type in the circumpolar Arctic. Priya's paper, published in the Journal of Animal Behavior the same month, documented the AVF 2291 case in full and proposed a new research framework for studying sustained maternal behavior in wild canids under extreme environmental stress. It was read by more people outside the scientific community than inside, which was unusual for that journal. The comments section of the university press release included a message from a structural engineer in Oslo who had read about the case and wanted to know if the acoustic sensor data from the extraction was available for analysis. It was, and he analyzed it, and he found 3 things in it that Calloway had not noticed. That work is ongoing. Elena still runs the Kilometer Post 7 patrol route every May. The monitoring pin at the collapse site is still there, a small orange flag in the tundra, and she checks it every time she passes. She has not seen AVF 2291 again. In a way that she can confirm, Arctic foxes at 3 years old in good condition have a reasonable chance of living another 4 or 5 years. But the tundra is large, and the transponder tag has a limited read range. She might be out there. She probably is. What Elena finds herself thinking about on the long May mornings when the sun doesn't set and the tundra stretches white and flat in every direction is not the rescue itself. She has thought about that enough, turned it over enough, looked at it from enough angles. What she thinks about is the 3 days before, the 72 hours when no one came, when there was no drill and no acoustic sensor and no geotechnical engineer with a pad of graph paper. When there was nothing at Kilometer Post 7 except a fox and 2 meters of ice and a sound that kept coming from below. She stayed. That's the fact that Elena keeps returning to, the one that doesn't resolve cleanly into data or protocol or a mechanism that current models fully account for. She stayed because she could still hear them. And maybe that's all the explanation there is. Or maybe Elena thinks we're only just beginning to understand what that means.